We have a bonus video this week in addition to the weekly Sunday video. I wanted to get this video out as quickly as possible following the flight. It's a very special flight as it's the inaugural flight of Atlantic Airways between the Faroe Islands and Stewart, New York, the first time ever that these two countries have been connected with a direct airline service. Located about halfway between Iceland and Scotland, you'll find a roughly 18-island archipelago that's an autonomous region of Denmark known as the Faroe Islands. Beautiful cliffs, mountains, shores, and architecture, but it's fairly isolated from the world with only one small airport. Today was the very first time that this airport saw scheduled transatlantic service as the Faroe Islands flag carrier Atlantic Airways launched its brand new service from the airport in the Faroe Islands to Stewart, New York, a budget travel option about 75 miles outside of New York City. The airport here is in one of the few places it could possibly fit on the main island in between multiple hills, as you could see from the Arrival video. It's not the biggest airport with only 2 gates and no jet bridges, but that's alright because they only had a handful of flights a day. I'd estimate that there is probably about 10. Of those, all but a select few are within the Schengen zone, or the visa-free zone of travel within Europe. This means that they have very few flights that actually require the immigration stand that they do have set up at the airport. Once inside the terminal, you'll see a fairly small lobby area where arriving passengers exit, in addition to the listing of the arrivals and departures. It's around the corner from that we find the check-in, however, just past a couple of Faroe Island tourism shops. Just past the ticket counter, you're going to find 2 check-in desks that's shared by all of the airlines here that fly into this airport. Just past the counters, however, is a small restaurant cafe and then some seating with wonderful ramp views where I got to watch the SAS plane that I came in on depart, as well as a different Atlantic Airways plane arrive and depart again. I sat there for a little while watching airplanes while the smell of food just taunted me, so I decided to get up and just get a hot dog. It was a turtle-style hot dog, as apparently that's more common here, and he was weirded out when I asked for more than one sauce, so maybe that isn't normal here. Because of how small the airport is, check-in doesn't open until about an hour and a half before departure, so I waited around since I arrived about 3 to 4 hours before departure. Once we got closer to departure, however, I noticed some slight decorating beginning, specifically a table with goodies being set up. I went to see the goodies they had at the table decorated in red, white, and blue, as that's the colors of the Faroe Islands flag and the US flag. I found miniature cupcakes, juice boxes, and coffee. Not exactly signature items for either destination, but it was fun to see festivities beginning. And finally, about 2 hours before departure, people began queuing for check-in. A little earlier than normal, they began checking us in as they had to perform visa checks for each passenger, so the self-service check-in kiosks weren't really an option. You can see here that was my first shot where I walked up to the self-check-in kiosk, entered my reservation code, and it gave me this message that I had to check in with the agent. So just like everyone else, I decided to get in the line and wait around. Unfortunately, our plane decided to arrive while I was waiting in line, and I didn't want to leave the queue to get some footage. Luckily, because of the giant windows throughout the terminal, I was still able to get some shots of it as it landed and then taxied in. After I got my boarding pass with the verification stamp from the check-in agent, it was off to security, which was extremely quick and easy, although the automated gates to enter security required you to select your nationality and they didn't have USA. After some searching, I found a North America option, so I just used that. Security dumps you out in the duty-free store, which comically enough might be larger than the entire rest of the terminal. Outside of the duty-free store, we reached the 2 gates here. One is set up with an immigration stand to be used for flights leaving the Schengen area, or both can be used if the flight is departing within the area, of which most of the flights here are. We also saw one little cafe that was serving all the passengers waiting for their flights, and quite a bit of seating, although unfortunately I noticed a definite lack of power outlets. There was one countertop similar to the restaurant cafe outside security that had charging ports, but that was pretty much it. From here, we also got to take a look at the public transit here in the Faroe Islands. Not that big airplane, I'm talking about the helicopter behind the airplane. In the islands, the buses are free to take, and the helicopters are so highly subsidized that they're at an extremely affordable rate. So next time I come to the islands, I may just have to use helicopter as my mode of transport. Unfortunately, there were some delays for our departure today as our departure time came and went. Perhaps the most upsetting thing is we never heard anything from the gate agents or Atlantic Airways employees standing there, which I've decided is probably one of my biggest pet peeves since usually someone knows something, and yet they just don't relay that to the passengers. Multiple of the passengers were getting up and going to the gate agent, I'm assuming to ask what was going on, but we never really got an answer, making people a bit antsy. This also brought another thought to my head. Since that table in the reception area, there hadn't been any sort of celebration for this momentous flight. I figured at the very least, once they realized it's delayed, they could have one of the Atlantic Airways higher-ups get up and speak about the flight and whatnot. Even if it wasn't entirely planned, it would stoke up excitement for the flight while also distracting passengers from the delays. We ended up boarding a little more than 30 minutes after our scheduled departure, and eventually ended up leaving a little over an hour late. After getting my passport stamped and boarding pass scanned, I was out to the ramp as my favorite way to board a plane is when the plane is immediately in front of the terminal, but you still get to walk to it. No bus required. Welcome to Atlantic Airways A320neo. This plane is set up in an all-economy seating plan and a fairly basic economy class at that. Considering the large majority of their flights are only about 1 to 2 hours, this cabin's perfect, so it'll be interesting to test it out on a 7-hour flight. Speaking of which, on my trip this month to get my videos, I crossed the Atlantic 4 times in total, and only one of them was on a wide body, which just seems a little bit unusual, at least in my brain. Taking a look around these economy seats, they're fairly basic, starting with a recline feature on all rows except for 10 and 11 as they back up to emergency exits and therefore don't recline in order to keep the pathway clear. The recline wasn't terrible. I'd estimate it was probably about 4 to 6 inches maybe. In front of you, there's no seatback TV screen, but they do have the tablet holders that are found on airlines like Alaska Airlines a bunch nowadays, with a grippy base to sit the device on, and then a clip on top to hold it in place. In the hard shell literature pocket, there was a few things, including the safety card, the menu for food and drink for purchase, and the Atlantic Airways magazine, which seems to be on the third revision of the year as opposed to monthly. And this magazine was thick and had a bunch of good information, mostly about all the Faroe Islands and the history of this airline, which would have been wonderful if I spoke Dutch or Faroean, which is their own little branch of the Dutch language specifically spoken on these islands. They did have a part of it advertising the launch of this very flight, including things about New York and points of interest, so it was fun to see what items they chose to advertise to the locals visiting New York, some of which for the first time. The back of the magazine had some games, which were almost all played already, which is the main drawback of only replacing this a few times a year. In addition, after that, we saw some of the onboard duty-free sale items, and then the very last page specifically was about the airline, including their destinations and the entire fleet. Not the types of aircraft, but specific tail numbers in their fleet of their 2 A320ceos, their 2 A320neos, and their 2 Augusta Westland helicopters. Taking a look through the menu, which is a little bit different. As with most low-cost airlines, there's no free food or drink, although Atlantic Airways does offer complimentary coffee and tea to every passenger. They do have meal boxes, but those have to be purchased at least 24 hours before departure, so they have time to make them and load them. So instead, this is going to be all the stuff that's available for purchase for you. Below the hardshell literature pocket is a QR code for connecting to their in-flight Wi-Fi, which doesn't offer internet connectivity, but does get you access to a number of entertainment options that we're going to look at for sure once we get airborne. Below that is your tray table, which is your totally standard single-fold tray table with 2 slots for drinks and a sizable area for meals or for working. Under that is the soft pocket for storage, which you could use for things like your chargers and devices throughout the flight. I noticed about half the seats had air sickness bags, so either a ton of people got sick on the last flight, or they ran low when restocking the airplane during its 3-hour turn. Even further below that is the under-seat storage, which is generous. You can see that, especially without bags there, I, at 5'9", have plenty of room for not only my feet, but also my knees. If you do put a bag there, it does rob most of your foot room, although you do still have some space to the side of your bag to extend your legs, and your knees aren't really a problem either. So in that sense, the seat was actually pretty comfortable. And adjacent to that is 2 USB-A charging ports. There's 2 ports between each seat, so 4 per row, but surprisingly no universal charging ports, so my laptop wasn't going to work out on this flight. To the right is the immovable armrest by the window that proved a little harmful when I tried to get some sleep, as it just kept digging into my side. And above that is 2 windows. At least from my point of view, it looked like each seat had at least 1 window, with most of them having 2. And last but not least, I have to give that shout out to those overhead air vents. I remember the day I learned what this sticker means, so I'm going to pose a question to you guys. Do you guys know what this sticker means? You'll find 2 on each side of the aircraft. To stick with my theme, we'll keep a quick video of the lavatory in here. However, because it's just your normal A320, there's nothing special at all. It has, I guess, their own little brand of soap, but other than that, the bathroom's pretty basic. As we settled in, getting ready for pushback, the rain set in as the later the day got, the lower and grayer the clouds got. Slightly a bummer because it was going to rob us of our beautiful view on takeoff, so that landing video for my arrival will have to satisfy that scenery itch. As we taxi, I just want to mention that marketing Stewart Airport as New York might not be a total lie, but it definitely stretches the truth, as it's over 50 miles straight line distance from the city and closer to 75 miles by car. The drive's about an hour and a half, and there's not the best train connection, as you have to take a bus or an Uber to the train station that's about 15 to 20 minutes away, then get on a long train to Grand Central before going where you need to in the city. Aside from the 3 main New York area airports, there are 3 to 4 airports with commercial service that are closer to the city than Stewart. They just don't mark themselves as New York. On the flip side, with Newark, JFK, and LaGuardia essentially at capacity, there had to be an option for growth at a supporting airport, especially one with low fees that could allow for low-cost carriers, both international and domestic. And the existing airports in the area, like Islip, White Plains, and Trenton, weren't great fits for that. And so it left New Haven or Stewart as the best option. So I do kind of understand the decision, but I can imagine that over time, especially for the history of international arriving passengers, that there have probably been some people shocked at just how far they were from New York upon landing and trying to get to the city. Once in flight, it was time to plug in before starting to look through the in-flight entertainment options. By connecting to the Wi-Fi, it should automatically direct you to the home page, but if not, you can scan the QR code or type in the address. And once I got to the home page, I was actually pleasantly surprised at what I saw. For starters, there was a good selection of entertainment categories with movies, TV shows, games, kid zones, map, etc. First things first was the movies. There aren't genres to sort by, but even still, there was a good selection of movies, plenty of stuff that I would be happy watching on this flight, which was somewhat surprising considering the short length of their average flight. They also had the interactive map feature, which could be zoomed in and moved around. The only issue is that the size of our airplane didn't change on the map, and so when I'd zoom out to try and see the whole route, I would commonly lose the airplane somewhere over the ocean. There were slightly less TV shows than movies, which is okay because there's multiple episodes of the TV shows. Once again though, I was pleasantly surprised by the options. I'm also enjoying seeing the Big Bang Theory replaced by Young Sheldon on most airlines, as it seems like a real changing of the guard. They also had a podcast section which had podcasts from around the world if that's something that you're into. Then there was a category called entertainment, which seemed to be more like YouTube video type content, from the fantastic Miss Mojo's ever-growing top 10 lists to the scientific study type videos from Unveiled, which was an awesome touch to have in addition to the normal TV and movies in my opinion. They also had a few different newspapers from around the world, which was great to be able to see for those passengers interested. In a similar fashion, there was also a great selection of magazines as well. So if you're someone who enjoys reading content as opposed to video content, I have a feeling you'll be well satisfied on this airline. They also had a smaller section of specifically Faroese news for those interested. Below that, there was also a selection of games, which was fairly standard but offered a good selection. Below that was the kids zone with additional entertainment options and games specifically for kids. On the top right, the button to pull up the menu gave you a couple extra options. First off was an electronic copy of the menu. It also included some fun facts about the Faroe Islands, like how sheep and puffins outnumber the people, and how it's one of the most common places to find grass roof houses. You'll also find a great English to Faroese translator. It has a number of standard phrases that are used, and also a text box to type in phrases for translation. Although the in-flight translator is limited and mostly just good for sorting through the saved phrases. They also have a section about the history of Atlantic Airways, going on and on about their now 35-year history, including their fleet and their routes as well. And then it also included another way to get to the same entertainment options that we had on the home screen. The best part, however, was that I was sure that the Flappy Bird app was sent to die by the creator back about 8 to 10 years ago. Turns out though, it's just sitting here on Atlantic Airways' in-flight entertainment portal, so that was fun to reminisce on. Now, I guess we can categorize this as constructive criticism, but personally, I feel that where air travel is these days, there's no reason that new aircraft can't have Wi-Fi installed, considering a good chunk of airlines are even moving towards free Wi-Fi. Even Spirit has Wi-Fi for purchase. I will say though that I'm definitely grateful for everything that Atlantic Airways has provided us in their portal, but I personally just don't get new airplanes that are built without that. About an hour after takeoff, they came on the PA to welcome us on board the flight and let us know that we would be doing a lot of the commemorative activities on board, starting with free drinks for everyone all flight long, which is fantastic since they usually run for about $4 to $8 depending on the drink. And as we passed the southern coast of Iceland, it was mealtime. As mentioned, the meals are available for purchase anytime from when you book the reservation up until 24 hours before your flight. They do send you email reminders so you can get a meal if you want one, but if you don't order one, you'll be limited to the onboard menu, which is just little snacks and drinks. I ordered the New York meal, which came with a small pasta salad, 2 open-faced seafood-based sandwiches, and a coconut brownie. And while it may not be winning any awards, it was definitely fantastic food. I took advantage of the free drinks by getting a can of Pepsi along with another glass of water. Mid-meal, I noticed, however, that my movie stopped playing, and upon investigation, I realized that the Wi-Fi had cut out. Essentially, once we passed Iceland, the Wi-Fi service was in and out at best, usually being out for the remainder of the flight, so while watching my movie and using the map in 15-minute increments, I eventually had to go back to other things. I'm wondering if this was an outage they anticipated, or if we're all just learning about this together on that flight. But good to know so you don't rely on it, and you can download some backups. I opted to get a couple hours of sleep instead. However, sometimes the best entertainment is just right outside your window, when the captain called up to let us know that we were going to be flying past Greenland, and not only could you see the country of Greenland, but you could also see a bunch of glaciers that were floating around just off the coast. Once we wrapped up our meal, it was time for more festivities as we had our main guest speaker, the CEO of Atlantic Airways, Johanna Albergi, whose name I'm probably butchering, so I really apologize for that. The best part of her speech, however, was towards the end when she announced we would all be getting free Prosecco and chocolate truffles. So the flight attendants came down the aisle with their cart with US flags on it, offering up these little personal Prosecco bottles and two little chocolates, one having pistachio flavor and the other one seeming to be more of a coconut flavor. In the back of the cabin, they had more of those chocolate truffles and some waters for passengers who needed a bit more in flight. In addition to that, the flight attendants also came through the aisle, frequently offering refills of tea or coffee. Speaking of the flight attendants, I got to talking to one of them just about Atlantic Airways since this was my first time flying with them. We talked about how this is their new longest flight, whereas previously it was their Canary Island flight, clocking in at around 5 hours. In addition, they do a lot of charters, specifically seasonal charters to Dubai from Denmark, which can be quite long in an A320. I also learned that the crew only gets one night and then flies right back, so they stay in Stewart and don't even get to visit the city, and they seem kind of bummed about that, but it's the unfortunate truth about using an alternative airport that's a little further from the city. Lastly, we were talking about how short-lived this route is, for only about 6 weeks. Our theory was that they will most likely use it as a trial to decide if it's worth keeping around, and if they get the loads they like, we might see it a bit longer. I will say this flight was probably about 75% full just by eyeballing it, although it looked like a lot of those were crew or personnel that worked for the airline. Then came the second meal of our flight, which included some fruit, little charcuterie bites, some bread, and some crackers with butter and jam. I opted to just get water for this meal since, for whatever reason, I was insanely dehydrated the whole time, just drinking an inhuman amount of water and feeling like it was doing nothing. I guess it's time for some electrolytes when we land. After that meal, we were coming over Canada and had a little over an hour left before landing, and the main thing I noticed was that the energy was poppin'. I'd say the large majority of passengers were from Denmark visiting the US, mostly here for this momentous flight, as I saw very few US passports on check-in and boarding. Also verified on landing based on how many people went to the US passports line versus the other line. The whole flight, people were chatting, and on other inaugurals, energy starts to fade typically after the first meal service. But for all 7 hours, people were walking around, talking, laughing, and genuinely having a great time, and it was such a fun environment to be a part of, and I guess it speaks volumes to how much passengers and employees enjoy Atlantic Airways. Speaking of which, this flight has been awesome, but I do have to wonder how much of this was only for the inaugural. Like, obviously, the free drinks, Prosecco, chocolates, and energy wouldn't be the same on your basic everyday flight, so maybe in the future, when I go back to actually spend some time in the Faroe Islands, I'll fly with them again just to see what the quote unquote normal experience is like. The last thing I want to mention as we descend towards Stewart, New York, is that this may have been my second favorite crew of all time. I only say second because if we're being honest, nothing's ever going to beat Emirates' first class crew. This crew, however, just seemed to be having so much fun. I'm sure it helped how much fun the whole cabin was having, but they were just always smiling, asking if we needed anything, striking up conversation with people, and the moment that really amazed me was when I mentioned to one of them that from Stewart I had a 2 hour drive to my hotel in New York City. She offered me a sandwich and a drink for the road, which was absolutely incredible. In all honesty, at this point, I'd fly the airline again just because of the crew.
Goedemiddag, welkom till New York, Stewart.
Now, Atlantic Airways is a low-cost airline, although I'm not sure I'd group it in the ultra-low-cost carrier, considering I was able to get things like checked bags included with my ticket. With no premium cabins, Wi-Fi, or universal charging ports, they are a bit behind most carriers, but I do see them right in lockstep with their direct competition in those aspects. In addition, the majority of their routes are only an hour or two, which is much different than a 7-hour transatlantic flight. I'm 100% going back to the Faroe Islands, and I might try out Atlantic Airways again just because of that crew. However, I'd probably choose to fly SAS instead, just due largely to the fact that right now Atlantic Airways doesn't have any partnerships, so you can't earn or redeem miles unless you're flying specifically with them. The main thing is that I do wonder how successful this route will be. The Faroe Islands are a beautiful place that is once again accepting tourists, but will it draw enough people for this seasonal route? Right now, it's only set to operate about 10 flights for this seasonal period, and my guess is that they'll use it as a test run to see if it's worth keeping for years to come. The only note I have on that is that Stewart Airport has become quite the budget airline hub, starting as the main US hub for Norwegian long haul before it spread across a number of reliever airports, and currently serving as a destination for Play Airlines, the rebirth of WOW Airlines, which also flew to Stewart, I believe. Those airlines found great success, largely due to being able to connect passengers in most places throughout Europe. This is something I feel Atlantic Airways might be missing. They do connect to a good handful of European destinations, but definitely far less than Play and Norwegian did. I do love seeing these new routes pop up, and I'm always rooting for them to succeed, but there's a lot of trial needed to prove if this is a viable route for US to Europe travel. Now, as far as I could tell, it looked like arriving passengers deplaned by air stairs and headed out to the immigration, which was on ground level, and then people getting on the plane could board by jet bridge, considering that there's no immigration for outbound passengers. Possibly one of the best things about international flights into smaller airports like this is that you can avoid the customs at JFK and Newark, and instead go through a much quicker and smaller customs like here in Stewart. So for example, by the time I got my bag, I was able to be out at the curb in a matter of minutes. Now here's the funny part, I was waiting for my bag along with everyone else, and little by little, everyone got their bags while I sat there waiting for mine as more and more customers disappeared. As it turns out, my bag was the absolute last bag to come out, as my bag popped out and then the carousel stopped, and everyone else had already gotten in line for immigration. Outside of immigration, the party continued as we got things like Stewart Airport socks, we got things like cake pops, they had cookies and cupcakes, and then they obviously had the speaker stand, where eventually the CEO got up and spoke to the people in addition to people from the city and people from the airport, all ending with a ribbon cutting. In addition, I mentioned how far Stewart Airport is from New York. You do have the ability to pre-book a bus that takes you to the Port Authority station in New York City for $25. There were 2 buses sitting out here, so I went outside to book those. However, they advised me that both of these entire buses were for the airline employees that were on board this flight. The crew, however, went to a hotel nearby the airport and didn't get to go to New York City. So instead, I just got in my Uber to the train and made my gentle way to New York City. But let me know your thoughts on Atlantic Airways and this new service direct from the US. But until this upcoming Sunday, safe travels, and I'll see y'all next time.